So as usual, we'll say the prayer for student and teacher. And join me as I say it. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astu Mahavitvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy and vigor. May our studies be illumined. May we not unnecessarily disagree with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So every Tuesday we have selected a subject to do with science and religion. But today we're in a great contemporary subject that people feel is worth investigating is the subject of consciousness. Because the scientific position about the mind is that the mind is really the brain. And so it presents us with a kind of brain-mind duality. And we know that brain is part of the body. And so the great philosopher Descartes, cogito ergo sum, as I think, so I am. And he made this dualistic separation, body and mind, separate. And in doing that, may have caused a little bit of confusion. And so we have to steer away from all positions of scripture and look at the various positions to do with this. And why should we study it? We study it because on the extreme side, consciousness is associated with an extra cosmic God. That's an extreme position on the one side. And on the other side is a scientific position that is abhorrent to that. Because for the last few hundred years, since the European wars, 30-year war, where nobody could agree on the nature of God, Protestant versus Catholicism, then it developed a new way of thinking which said, we will leave you to decide the post-mortem condition of God in heaven, and we'll attend to this world and start our investigation. And so we have a whole new revolution of thinking, investigating the known world, not leaving the other one behind, leaving God somewhere, no doubt, but the details of it, theologians can sort out. And so science had a kind of a boost, but along with it came materialism. Therefore, if you want to explain anything and everything in science, you really have to resort to a position that says we have to find an explanation in materialism. That means there is nothing in this world except matter, and that presents us with another extreme position that somehow, if you talk about consciousness, and we know it's connected somehow with the operation of the brain, we have to find out what is the mechanism that comes from the brain that gives us, in some cases, they say, the illusion of consciousness. Since we know that something that is material, a brain that we can put into a jar, will not do anything. A kind of electrical circuitry within it, with folds to make things much more efficient. It's a bit like the queues these days. Instead of making one long queue, you make a zigzag arrangement. It's an economic way of squeezing everything into a small area. And so these folds within the brain occur. And of course, along with that comes biological evolution that says that we can see the development from the reptilian brain to the mammalian brain to the neocortex of man. And we can see even amongst higher primates that there is empathy, there is a mental movement, and in that mental movement, we can hardly distinguish animal behavior, say with monkeys, from human behavior. There's an ingenuity in there, there's a strategy in there. So the tests done with elephants and monkeys will show that there is a behavior similar to human behavior. And the materialist conclusion is man has just come to this point of evolution where, out of necessity for survival, an increased brain was necessary. Of course, this position does not solve the question of consciousness. What is it and where does it come from? And we cannot, for the time being, resort to our Vedanta scriptures to solve it. Even though we feel the answer may be there, we have to follow every line of investigation if we are to be truly scientific. That means open to all possibilities and see what is the most reasonable course and conclusions we can come up with. Now, there's one thing that we do know, that we are conscious beings. And we can hardly describe it. And so consciousness falls into two areas when we observe it. That is a common consciousness. If there's a table and 5 people in the room, everyone experiences the presence of a table. The universal consciousness, which is there, that defines objects in a sense of commonality. But then, how do I feel when I eat? Or how do I describe the color pink? Or how do I describe my feelings, true feelings? Or how do I register an internal shift of religious or spiritual experience? How will I describe it to another? This is qualia, that is subjective experiences, which I know exist, but only in me. And there's no evidence that it will occur to somebody else. I can say I had a dream last night, but because you never experienced a dream, you can only have to take my word for it. But we have a commonality of experience called dreaming. And the ancient people, the ancient rishis, for example, those who investigated these things, who did not take any pre-existing axioms, except I exist and I am a conscious being. This existence infers I'm aware of this existence. And so there's at least a self-consciousness that incorporates many different factors, including a sense of ownership, a sense of I. You can hardly describe it, but there's no real feeling about it. And so the philosopher David Chalmers, for a long time, expressed this dilemma of what is consciousness and how does it work in a well-known phrase now, the hard problem of consciousness. And the hard problem of consciousness only really applies to our subjective experience. The objective experience we have no difficulty with, because there's a commonality of experience. And we also know that by changing the structure, as it were, of the brain, by shutting off some areas, by promoting other areas, by electrically animating some areas, and by understanding the brain and any different areas of reactions in the brain through MRI scanning, a product of quantum technology, that we are able to see that consciousness has a definite correlation with the brain. We cannot deny this. So that anesthetics work by numbing certain areas of the brain, and still, anesthetists will tell you, we're applying this, we don't exactly know how it works. And we can witness people in a coma, but the brain is still active. And we can register 5 brainwaves, different brainwaves at different stages. And the great, great philosopher and psychologist, Patanjali, gave us a yoga philosophy that says there is a mind stuff. That is also called consciousness. Chitta, mind stuff. What is this mind stuff? It infers that there is a broader universal thing that is attracted in a localized way, and we call it my consciousness. It is so complex because it incorporates many different parts and factors and faculties. And Patanjali notices this and says there are 5 modifications of these waves that come out. classified, and in many subcategories, but classified broadly as types of waves, incorporating right knowledge. The knowledge that we have when truth dawns on us and produces a certain brain wave, and we can register that, but it doesn't give us any stress. It doesn't give any byproducts that the other waves give. Right knowledge, wrong knowledge is also there, and most of us are laboring under this overall category of waves because we see a world and we take it and we take our interpretation of it, and it requires a mind with the mechanism of the brain, no doubt, to interpret what we see in order that we may relate to the world. But we know, because scientific investigation tells us, and philosophical, metaphysical investigation tells us, that it doesn't pass the currency of what is real. What we mean by what is real, the nature of reality should be something that is absolutely permanent. It doesn't have any characteristic of change. It doesn't have any occupation within space because that makes it an object. And wherever there's an object, there must be a perceiving subject. Everything that we understand in our mind requires an understanding, a seer, a knower, some entity which is there, and something which is observed. And this duality has to be there in order for us to perceive something. And what we know is whatever we perceive has to be different from the perceiver. Now, the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita deals with this whole subject. It says that there is a field of our consciousness. And consciousness, we are conscious of this field. Never mind what consciousness is, except that if we really want to find the root of it and see what is this absolute subjective aspect of consciousness, then we have to ask only one question. Whatever you declare, whatever position you take, you're going to ask, who knows it? Who is the knower of the field? And so the Kshetrajna chapter, Bhagavad Gita, 13th chapter, describes these two things, that there is something perceived and a perceiver, a field and a knower of the field. Then Krishna gives a remarkable statement. Know me to be the knower in all the fields. There is only one consciousness. Now, Schopenhauer, who was a physicist, but was bold enough to explore every single scientific avenue, because we have to have a broader interest in life, rather than if you are a specialist in one area, it doesn't bar you from being interested in all the other areas. And a true scientist will want to know about every single avenue that he can come across. Broadly described as fields. And we use this expression, of course, in many different areas. What is your field? It means what is your scope of expertise? Or what is your job? And then we also use field in the sense of experience. It describes a limitation somewhere. It describes an area comparable to literally a field. A field where cows graze, or where open field of grass or agriculture. A field is a field. And then there's a military field, a field of operation. And it so happens that the whole analogy that is used in Mahabharata, condensed into the Bhagavad Gita, is situated on a battlefield. That is called life. Life is a field that we engage in. And in order to do that, we have to be conscious entities, aware of what is threatening us, aware of how we will react, and there is a conscious willing side to it. For example, I decide I'll raise my hand, my arm. It's not an illusion. I simply do this. I raise the arm and put it down. You cannot say that this is illusion. What you can say is that there was a conscious activity, a decision made. The arm was raised, the arm was lowered. And I can do it according to my choice anytime I like. So consciousness has within it a capacity to choose, to exert a control. But then the question comes, who is the one who is deciding? What is that ultimate executive decision maker? And is that conscious, or is that consciousness itself? What is the difference? If you say it is conscious, you have to look for another owner. If you say it's consciousness itself, then it says it's a manifesting entity that comes out as conscious understanding, conscious awareness, and expression of consciousness in every aspect, coming out as awareness, coming out as exertion of will, coming out as observation, coming out as observation of decision making, coming out as awareness of feelings and emotions, and all waves coming up and going down within a whole field. Let us call this field a mental field. Let us call its relationship to the so-called external world as the external field, and the relationship is between that observer of the field and the field itself. And then we can go and describe many fields integrated together. The physical field, we understand. But we can't understand its totality because a restriction is there. We can't see in front and behind simultaneously. So it depends on the external faculties of the senses, and the Indian psychologists understood the real indriyas, the real senses, are not the organs which we find as eyes and ears and so on. There are some faculties, inward faculties, because we can close our eyes and we can still inwardly see. We can replicate what we see. We can use our memory and reconstruct any picture we like. And immediately a word is produced. A corresponding image goes on in some internal realm, and we are conscious of it. So if we investigate the brain, there are neuropsychologists who've done this or neurobiologists who've done this, and to try and find out what is the seat of consciousness and what is the seat of memory, and we cannot find any localized version of it. And so Susan Greenfield, who is a dame and won many awards, in investigating techniques to find out what is going on in the brain when consciousness occurs. Where is the seat of it? Can we localize it? Can we make it a locality? Assuming that the brain must be producing this consciousness on the basis that anesthetic and other means can create a state of unconsciousness. But does it really? So the ancient philosophers went into this in a very wonderful and precise investigative way based on your own conscious experience. There is a waking consciousness, no doubt, and there's a very complex relationship between this waking consciousness and what I deem to be a sense of I. And it incorporates a physical body, it incorporates an identity, and that incorporates also a brain. Now you see, that's not the only version of consciousness, because as we know, we slip into an area and we can measure the brain waves associated with this area called dream. And this dream is no doubt a conscious area, which is a replay of unconscious impressions derived from the waking state. And so Patanjali tells us or infers that there is something called deep sleep, and there's something called right knowledge, there's something called wrong knowledge, there's another thing which is called imagination. You jump to a conclusion. Somebody tells you something, and you then make a whole internal story about it, normally an exaggerated version, bringing up all kinds of suspicions, all kinds of feelings of defense and jealousy, all kinds of feelings of unsettlement, and ultimately even anger comes up, and you find out at the end it's a It's really a verbal delusion, but the verbal side of it comes from you. It doesn't come from somebody else. It is all your inward maneuverings. In the Enneagram, we have that saying, I wrote myself an angry letter and received a defiant reply. All our conversation is with ourselves. Even with others, we are listening to ourselves. And so this inward conversation, this inward dialogue, which really is a monologue, is going on constantly. And with all of this, we're producing and aggravating the overall field of consciousness into various waves. And we are still conscious of each wave. So it still doesn't answer this question, what is consciousness? Objective consciousness, awareness, we understand. Where is it coming from? We don't understand. If we simply take the biological view. But if you take the philosophical analyst, if you take an introspective view, you will see that at each stage of objective consciousness, there is a knower. There is a field and there is a knower. There's a field of multiplicity with all kinds of people and places and events registered, and then there's a reactive field to it that says, I interpret this as this, and I feel this about it as well, and nobody has access to it except me. And this is very personal, but we know it is there. And what condition will the brain have when all of this comes? We can't trace any particular origin. So the Baroness, the Dame, Susan Greenfield comes to a conclusion, the same conclusion as the Sankhya and Yoga psychologists. It is something like a lake. There is a mind or a mental field, something like a lake. We won't argue whether it is beyond material or not, or immaterial, because according to this system, it is material. If you starve yourself for 3 days, your memory goes. It's as material as anything else, but it is subtle. And so we're not saying that it is something, some ephemeral world called mind that is outside the brain or outside the body. It is something that is connected with the instrumentality of the brain. That is how it is described. But the instrumentality is something misunderstood because we cannot trace its direct connection with the brain's activity. And we cannot say it comes up from the brain, and we cannot say definitively it is an epiphenomena of the brain. It must be something which is intrinsically connected with the brain, and yet we cannot locate it. This produces an analogy for us. What is this analogy? The analogy is you have a light bulb or a circuitry, and behind the circuitry you'll find electrical energy, an electric field, a whole field, an electromagnetic field. Well, let's give an example. In the Kalahari Desert, there are what is commonly called Bushmen. The Khoi tribe or Sand tribe, they've learned to live in the desert. They really don't know anything about modern technology. They've never seen an electronic circuit before, and they come across a radio, and they listen, and the radio seems to crackle and talk. A voice is coming from it. Where is this voice coming from? And then they see inside this box some circuitry, and they see wires. And they understand if I disconnect a wire, then the voice goes. When I reconnect it, the voice comes back. So I understand there's a connection with the wiring to what I'm hearing and understanding as a voice, a product of call or radio. There is no knowledge, because there's no previous experience, that there is a microwave tower somewhere beaming radio waves. They have no idea that it's an electromagnetic field. They have no idea that electrical waves are spread vastly in the ethereal space, and nobody has seen them, and yet they're all permitting waves carrying things. carrying different features according to their wavelength. Some carrying heat, some carrying sound, some carrying gamma rays, some carrying X-rays, some carrying infrared, some carrying ultrasonic. We have no understanding or knowledge of it, no previous experience of it. And so is it not something similar? When people look for consciousness in the circuitry, they won't find it. And so I think we can say, what about if there's something beyond it? Something outside it, as material, no doubt, but very, very subtle and more universal, so that it is something more like a broadcasting wave system, an electromagnetic wave system, that anybody at any moment can catch it, given the fact that we have the wiring to do it. And with that wiring, we can catch whatever we like. And when two people tune into that same broadcast together, we say, oh, this is a wonderful thing, a paranormal phenomena called telepathy. But as scientists, we won't investigate it because it doesn't seem to be scientific. So by focusing on the circuitry, we have endorsed something not necessarily true, that there is materialism. And then by assuming that there is something beyond the wiring circuitry, we are not assuming that it is not material either. And when we say it's immaterial, we're going to the other extreme and invoking unnecessarily a God. So we have to find some reasonable middle ground, which is both scientific, which is both has a utility as well. Now, what is the use of talking about all these things on a Tuesday evening when we are supposed to be giving a spiritual talk? What relevance does it have to our spiritual life? The relevance is like this. It doesn't end with simply the provision of a circuitry and a provision of something like an electromagnetic field beyond. When we go even further beyond and further beyond, we find that one broadcasting station, that universal entity, is free. And its freedom is expressed. Its freedom is evidenced by our limited freedom of choice or free will. This is really what we can describe as cosmic mind. We can call this Hiranyagarbha, cosmic mind. What's the use of understanding that? Well, if something has a practical use, it's useful, no doubt. And if something is universal, it's more widely applicable also. It means that we have a formula to get whatever we want, for good or bad. It just requires a thought movement, because the thought arrives as a product of the thinker. It is the thinker's manifested energy that we call individual thought. We can use it and mobilize it. Why? Because we are the observer of it. We are the controller of it. We are the witness of it. We are the knower. We are the thinker behind all the thinkings. Asserting our freedom to steer thought waves as we like. Please go here, please go there. This is called meditation. And this flow of thought and meditation will always produce a result from us, for good or bad. Don't think that meditation will always produce good. Ravana was a meditator and got his power, got his gift from Brahma, the cosmic mind, through his meditation. Where we can decide to meditate in such a way that we can reconcile the thing that we want the most. What do we want the most? The whole of humanity is assessing that there's some goal of perfection somewhere, some utopia, some area where we will not suffer. And theology can call this heaven. And then on the other side is a hell. We don't want the hell. The hell is full of suffering and pain. And there's a process between the one extreme and the other. And we have to discover what that process is. Now, if you simply say that process is morality and ethics, and that the origin of morality and ethics is centered in material life, that we are really trying to preserve ourselves, and we inherited biologically and all these other things that materialism would provide, well, that does not explain why a person will be completely self-sacrificing, have a generosity of spirit that says, let me forget about myself and let me now embrace the entire world. Let me share my love with everybody, irrespective of what they think of me or irrespective of any reward that I get. I don't want any reward, actually. And then if I'm going against this biologically evolutionary trail of survival, that I'll do everything at all costs in order to perpetuate my life, my way of living, and the human species. Well, then the greatest characters in our history, such as Buddha, such as Jesus, such as Ramakrishna, will be magnificent failures. There is no advantage to what they did. There's no advantage to Jesus dying on a cross. There's no advantage for Buddha to say, let me be unconditionally compassionate, just for the sake of love, that's all. Let me be the servant of humanity. Let me be the instrumental avenue, gateway for the upliftment of the whole of humanity, not just those who are part of my religion or part of my caste or my family. Genetic love is limited, and every animal will have it. It doesn't give us any superior advantage. It doesn't make us more civilized. And so these great giants are there. In history, we also find the oppressors are there. But they live and they die, and every empire came and every empire went. But the Jesus movement lived for now over 2,000 years, and Buddhism 2,500 years, and the Vedic system appearing as Hinduism for several thousands of years, maybe even 10,000 years, and maybe more. And so we have the inheritance of something pretty solid. We have the inheritance of a Judeo-Christian tradition or an Abrahamic tradition that for good or ill, no matter how much it comes under a firing line, has produced the most remarkable cohesiveness in humanity, as well as the evils as well. And this we find in the construction of churches, magnificent structures that took tens of years, maybe hundreds of years in some cases, with art and culture, and bringing in various strata and structures of society, bringing in architects and painters and poets, bringing people in who are laborers, and making clever construction materials with construction techniques and pulleys, lifting huge loads, bringing stone from vast distances. What is the motivation for us to do this as humanity, if not for some kind of greater good, some kind of intangible thing, where we're looking for access to a kind of utopia? Call it theologically heaven if you like, away from an unwanted area, let us say a hell of a life. And then there's a pain in the process also, because in the process is also kind of hell. I always remember, and I often quote, there was a Lutheran minister who told me once, the difference between religion and spirituality is the religious people say there's a hell, but the spiritual say yes, and we've been through it. Part of the process is that suffering. And despite that, we still want to move on to it. And we engage in all kinds of discipline, all kinds of asceticism, all kinds of practices designed to control and strengthen the will, and do it externally and do it internally. Do self-discipline called tapasya, self-discipline, self-control. Do all of that for what? Understanding that when I assert my masterliness, then all the instrumentality, including the external consciousness, including the faculty of intelligence, using these faculties of intelligence, using the faculties of the mind as objective things, as instrumental things, I can steer myself in an area where the full consciousness becomes expanded beyond the small conscious area of my existing world of a waking state, beyond the consciousness that is registered in multiple events of ephemeral dreams, and beyond the consciousness of a felt peace that is found even under anesthesia, under coma, and in deep sleep. There's still a registration of existence. And this registration of existence is not just a blank. It feels like a blank, no doubt, but it is an area of potential creativity. And if we stand there, we can then design a whole external world of experience, which is a conscious experience. And as we do that, all the synapses and neurological wiring of the brain becomes activated at our service. Just like the Bushman who discovered the wiring and how you disconnect something and how you can connect it and get the original thing back again. But the circuitry says nothing about what is supplying it. Supplying it is a flow of divine grace that is in our favor if we use it correctly, and is a creative area from which everything comes. You may say this is a kind of, it's coming to the idea of God and theology, and I would agree it is. You can use any language you like for it. And when you understand it, you'll surely evoke feelings of adoration and wonder and thankfulness. And tuning then into that cosmic mind, so that thy will be done is the prayer. Let my will be done as it is on earth as it is in heaven. Make that alignment, and you see, not only will you have the utility of transforming the entire world that becomes an area close to your utopia, but also you come closer to the truth so that you discover this ideal utopia is you and is pure consciousness itself. And that consciousness obviously manifests everywhere. Now, if it wasn't like that, we would not find any signatures of it in the world, and we do. We find signatures, when we tell in the Advaita philosophy about the illusion, as it were, of the snake superimposed on a rope. In the twilight of the day, we go out and we see something coiled up. We superimpose a snake on it, and we become fearful of that snake. We think this will attack us. We have now gone into verbal delusion. Our imagination has taken over. Our working consciousness has superimposed something, but we don't see it when it's revealed as a rope, as something dissimilar from a snake, or a snake dissimilar from the rope. It has the same kind of form. In this same way, this world of name and form has a clue toward its substance. Just as the wave, when we analyze it as water, gives us a clue to the entire ocean, which is nothing more than this water. You cannot get a separate water appearing as a wave. The water that flows over the Niagara Falls is the same water in Lake Erie and the same water after the Niagara Falls. It's not different water. So the substance is one. You cannot produce conscious experience without consciousness itself. This is not just only logical, but it is our own experience in answer to our question, who or what is the knower of all this experience? And relentlessly we can ask the question, registering every different field and every different knower of the field, one by one, until we can no longer go any further. And we have found, I am the knower, I am the thinker, I am the witness. And every movement, every examination, every conscious experience of it shows me this, that the mind has the capacity to shine a light on the outside and shine a light on the inside. And when we cultivate the inward lamp called meditation, it reveals itself to us. This is the process that takes us toward the blissful utopia we are seeking. And every person is looking for it. Now, how they get to it, that is a discovery. And we have to rely on those people who've made this experiment before us, who've trod the journey, and in trodding the journey, left us with a legacy, left us with a model and a formula. And the formula is, broadly speaking, exactly the same. We have to take the clutter of the mind, and we have to take these waves, fivefold waves, appearing as right knowledge, wrong knowledge, memory, sleep, and verbal delusion, until they all calm down nicely. And so when we began the study of the science of religion, we were really studying this Raja Yoga. And the more we study it, the more we see how simple a concept it is. Something like a lake appearing as waves. And I mentioned Susan Greenfield. She comes to this one conclusion that the ancient yogis had come to. No matter what system I use to analyze, where is this consciousness, I find no locality whatsoever. It's something like a lake. And you throw a pebble in it, and depending on how hard you throw it, and depending on the size of the rock you put in, it creates ripples and waves. And two types are there, one coming as a reaction and one coming from the outside inward. And the two corresponding, making ripples and waves in the ocean or in the lake. With this effect, we won't see the bottom of the lake. All we'll see is disturbance. We'll see distorted images. So what are the clues? See how Sri Ramakrishna gives us this beautiful example of different vessels of water with one sun. We haven't got the vision to see the transcendent. All we see is the reflection of these small suns in each vessel. And we assume that each one is an independent light, an independent sun. 10 vessels, 10 suns are there. 10 lives are there. Not understanding the reflective nature of what we're seeing. And so this consciousness is expressing itself when you add time and space as a fragmented version of itself, not something separate. When we see the rope, we realize we don't see it as any other thing. We don't see it as an animal. We don't see it as a table or a chair. We see it as a resemblance of what we saw in projection. And so this tells us something about the world. The world does not exist without this correlationship of the instrumentation of seeing and the condenser that is the observer that makes things collapse. This is now what we find out about quantum physics. Because in quantum physics, we have to find an explanation about how we see these waves as solid dissociated particles. And we know that it is held, so far anyway, in a kind of superposition. That's the speculation anyway. I don't say we know it. That's speculation. That's the interpretation of it. Held in an indeterminate superposition until we observe it, and then it comes out as what we see. In other words, there's a movement within us that condenses what we have into this world. Something like a thought movement from the cosmic mind that trickles down through all the quantum forces and produces the crest of a wave that is our world. And we endorse it and think it's everything. And then we start fighting and biting and scratching about it and forming jealousy camps to do with pride and difficulties and defending our position in an egoistic way against all what we consider to be people and who are against us, a struggling world. They're essentially hostile to us. that we have to defend ourselves against. It's a wrong interpretation of what is there. What is there? Consciousness expressed as waves, coming from a consciousness which we call cosmic mind, cosmic consciousness expressing itself. That when we access it, we determine what wave system we would like, what is the field that we would want, making a conscious movement toward it without contradicting it, and doing it in such a way that it is to the advantage of all, purifying the mind, clarifying the wave systems until there's enough clarity where we see the reality. So what are the clues of it? Well, supposing we have in our body 3 physical areas. Let us say there's the navel area, which really represents life. It was, after all, the source of life. We were connected by it, the umbilicus. This area to do with life and survival, and an area of the heart that represents emotion, and the brain that represents intellect, will describe surely what we see as the absolute. It is the absolute when we add time and space that comes out as something very similar. If we say that God is love, it really means that it explains why we are loving beings and why we wish to love and be loved, and why we love things that make us blissful and happy, and why we avoid things that make us sad and that is painful. If behind everything is existence itself, because you cannot get existence from non-existence. The existence itself is there. That gives us grounds to survive. That gives us grounds to perpetuate life and continue creation with procreation. Supposing we say that we are intelligent beings and we see rhythm and order and intelligence in the universe, even in so-called non-sentient things like rocks and galaxies and atoms, still some intelligence is there. An electron knows where the proton is. A piece of rock knows where the center of the earth is. Supposing we acknowledge all of this, then the source of it must be consciousness itself. Your nature is exactly this: existence, consciousness, and bliss absolute. And the Upanishads tell us exactly this. It is not just a transcendent being, like the rope separate from the snake. No, it is the rope appearing as a snake, appearing as the faculty of seeing it in this way, and playing this distorted game on us. And if it's a game, we shouldn't take umbrage at it. We shouldn't complain about it. We should rather take the sportive attitude and play the game, and play the game well, with this knowledge that it is not what it appears to be. This is called discernment. And the base of all spiritual life will be this kind of discernment in whatever approach you have, even the devotional approach, where you make God your constant companion and your primordial presence, meaning that the rest becomes diluted and relatively unimportant. Seeing God in everything and everyone gives extra value to it. It doesn't diminish from it. It's not a separation. God is somewhere else and I am here. It gives us an integrated view. Not just integrated, but it incorporates the very presence in our own life as pure consciousness. Naturally, it will be expressed through the instrumentation that we have. But not only that, but it is consciousness itself, the pure creative area, that produces the organic brain and produces the instrumentation of it and surrounds it. This is what we call the inner controller. There's a whole passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad giving so many examples that this is unknown to the external instrument. The instrument doesn't know it. It is the inner controller. All is from within. This really is the answer to consciousness, not only logically, but experientially. And so that's the science of consciousness. So I think we can leave it there. I haven't referred at all to the Patanjali passages. There are many passages that will refer to this directly and indirectly. And one thing will describe that area of expressed consciousness that is called egoism. It's the identification of the pure consciousness, which is the seer, with the instrument of seeing. And when we look at this, we can see precisely what has happened in the modern scientific materialistic explanation of what is the mind or what is consciousness. Consciousness is a product of the brain. It's another way of saying that consciousness that comes out as I consciousness or self-consciousness, what we call egoism, we see it as the identification of the pure consciousness, the seer, with the instrument, the brain, of seeing. And we don't care if you say brain or mind, it is all purely matter. The only thing is we say one is gross and the other is subtle. What is a subtle version, therefore, of the brain? This is what we call mind. And we have no business entering into the debate because it is all material. The seer is really the self, says Vivekananda in his commentary on this. The pure one, the ever holy, the infinite, the immortal. This is the self of man. And what are the instruments? The chitta or mind stuff, the buddhi, the determinative faculty, the manas or mind, and the indriyas or sense organs, internal. These are the instruments for him to see the external world, and the identification of the self with the instruments is what is called the ignorance of egoism. We say, I am the mind, I am thought, I am angry, or I am happy. I am the qualia, I am the subjective experience, and also I am the instrument, I am the brain, or the brain is really the mind, and the brain is consciousness, and the brain produces consciousness, and the brain is producing all of these things somehow magically by itself through some chemical interaction, not understood at all. Not understood at all. An epiphenomena of the brain, as it's called, some byproduct that is there purely for the purpose of survival. It's a very different view. So, how can we be angry and how can we hate? Swami Vivekananda asks, we should identify ourselves with this self that cannot change. How do we know it cannot change? Because if it was changing, we would notice it, and we're not. We're noticing all the other things that come from it. We're noticing the behavioral aspects. We're noticing the emotional aspects. We're noticing the reactive aspects. And we're noticing the mind itself as a field. And so we should identify it is unchangeable. How can it be one moment happy and one moment unhappy? It is formless, infinite, omnipresent. Because it was formed, if it was anything else, it would be subject to time and space, and time and space make the distinguishing factors that we see. And what can change it? It's beyond all law. And what can affect it? In other words, it's not material. Nothing in the universe can produce an effect on it. Yet, through ignorance, we identify ourselves with this mind stuff, this chitta, chit related to this consciousness, and think we find pleasure or pain. And then we become attached. And what is that attachment? Well, we find pleasure, of course, in certain things, and the mind, like a current, flows towards them. And following the pleasure center, as it were, is what is called attachment. We are never attached where we do not find pleasure. We find pleasure in very odd things sometimes, but principle remains. Wherever we find pleasure, there we are attached. In other words, there we have misidentified what is there. So there's this distinguishing factor. Consciousness, objective, subjective, and ultimately, pure consciousness is that which doesn't change. And there is our answer. We leave it at there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thanks.
Thank you, Swami. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Swamiji. Thank you, Swamiji.
Oh,
Swamiji, God bless you.
thank you. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Yeah.
Oh.